So to start with, observational research is basically the process of watching either people or animals and then systematically recording how it is that they behaved or what they were doing in those contexts. Now, while not automatically better than survey or poll-based research, they are specific contexts in which observational research can oftentimes lead to a more accurate representation of what is actually going on. Now, probably the biggest sort of split here will be surveys are great for getting people to talk about what they think are the reasons for why they do stuff or how much they think they are acting out in certain ways or not acting out in certain ways. And sometimes this will actually line up with what is actually going on in the world. But at the end of the day, when one truly wants to quantify behaviors, observational research is oftentimes the better way to go. That being said, just because observational research can lead to a more accurate sort of counting or representation of the actual behaviors that take place in the world doesn't automatically guarantee that the research you're doing is in fact valid and answering the questions about the variables you happen to have. So we'll go through a few of the things that could potentially hurt construct validity for any type of observational research. And probably the first and most common that comes up is observer bias. And this is talking about the bias that any observer brings to the table when they are watching somebody else or some animal's behaviors. Specifically, it is a bias that occurs when observer expectations influence the interpretation of participant behaviors or the ultimate outcome of a study. Now, your textbook has a great example of how a study was done, I believe in 1974. If I remember, we'll post the article on iLearn if you'd like to read it. Anyhow, the article talks about how they show a group of therapists a video recording of an individual who is talking actually to another therapist in the recording itself. Everyone is shown an exact identical copy of this video recording. The only difference, or the experimental manipulation in this case, is that half of the therapists are told that this individual is a patient of the therapist in the video recording, and the other half are told that this person is actually a job applicant. And then they're asked to make ratings on this person's personality and overall disposition. And the ratings of this individual are markedly different across those two conditions. And that just shows you even people who are ultimately trained to just observe and help people or individuals are strongly susceptible to these types of biases. Now, having bias is not necessarily a bad thing that one should endeavor to eliminate all bias, because at the end of the day, all human beings will always bring some form of bias to the table, because that is how an organism ultimately exists in the world. And there are some cases actually where bias can be beneficial, right? To be biased towards a version of scary things is largely advantageous in the world itself. So instead of trying to label this bias as good or bad, it is much more effective in research contexts to be able to identify when bias exists and to recognize when its effect should be minimized in order to not disrupt the ultimate outcomes of a study. Now, places you can see this actually is fairly easy in just daily life, which you don't often get to see these types of biases. Context of this would be you could just think of a time where you've seen someone out in the world itself act in a specific way and you were like, huh, that was strange, or you thought they did it for some specific reason, and then you tell a friend about it, and even better, a friend who's standing right next to you, and it turns out that they have a completely different interpretation of what just happened. That right there is showing one the lenses with which we look at the world are often quite different. And one of the biggest troubles that we have is we tend to believe that everybody else has the same lenses as us, which is actually also a bias. So one should be very careful of this whenever doing any type of observational research. Additionally, the specific situations and our current disposition, or like our current state of mind, will have a dramatic impact on how we interpret behaviors. So one of the biggest branches of study in social psychology is the different types of priming that the context can provide for an individual that will change how they interpret different situations. And there's a wonderful set of studies going back the last, I would say, 40, 50 years probably, that showed the dramatic ways in which you can manipulate people's understanding of a situation by subtle cues that you provide for them. So it is again important to know that this type of bias ultimately exists all over the place, and learning to manage it is really what's much more important than simply trying to eliminate it altogether. When it comes to dealing with observer bias, probably the most effective way of doing this is to use more than one observer, because if you only have one observer, you're unlikely to ever realize that that person is biased, because how would you know? There's nothing to compare to, and therefore you would never know. Now, that of course doesn't help if your two or ultimately more observers all have very similar biases, because they could all interpret some situation, they would all have very similar ratings. You could give them a statistical test for inter-rater reliability and correlate their observations, and they would all probably correlate very highly. But if all of them are ultimately biased in the same direction, that does not help you get out of the situation where your observers are biased. This is a real life example of a case where something can be reliable, but not necessarily valid. Akin to a scale that is 10 pounds off, it will always give you the wrong reading, but always by a consistent amount. It will always be reliable, but not valid. In this same case, you have observers who are always in a biased way giving you observations, but they're doing it in a similar way. So to further mitigate that type of effect, we oftentimes will give observers specific training on what types of things to look for, what types of things to ignore, and how to then code those. A lot of times you'll see in observational research the use of code books, and code books are documents that oftentimes will be included in an article itself, or at least in the supplemental index, but also given to observers, and these have very specific definitions of what counts as a specific type of behavior and what does not. And then people are given training on this that helps them be more specific and become a little bit more aware of their own biases and try to account for them. Another way you could potentially make this even better, though this will depend a lot on where you're doing research, is to have observers who come from different backgrounds, because the more diverse your observers, the less likely that they are going to have the same type of bias. And if you have a group of observers that all have very different forms of bias, and you can finally get them to agree, chances are they're getting closer and closer to an objective observation, because all their biases ultimately are working against each other and will ideally cancel out, much like random selection for participant pools. Another and maybe much more insidious effect that oftentimes creeps up in this type of research, but it is not limited to observational research. You'll find this even in experimental studies, is something known as observer effects, which will also be referred to occasionally as expectancy effects. And this is a change in behavior of any study participants in the direction of the observer's expectations. Now, if you're reading about this, or if you're reading about studies that are talking about something like this possibly coming up, one will often hear the term demand characteristics. And demand characteristics refer to the subtle cues that a researcher could give off, most of the time unconsciously, because if they're doing this consciously, that is more like an ethical violation and bad research practice. So pretty much this is almost always happening unconsciously. But anyway, these are cues that the researcher gives off that ultimately give away the goal of the study, or what they're hoping will happen in the case of this participant who is taking part in the study. And when a participant picks up on those cues, they will change their behavior, oftentimes bringing it in line with what the researcher is hoping. Because while this might be surprising to many people who are not actually in research, most participants who come in want to do a good job. And one of the biggest problems that can come up if you tell participants about what it is you're hoping to find is that they, trying to be good participants, will try to bring their responses in line with what they have been told this is likely to be the goal of the study, which is problematic because then you're not measuring what they're actually doing, but what they hope that you want them to do, which is a little bit confusing, I suppose. And to see how dramatic an impact this can have, there is this wonderful story of Clever Hans, which if you've not yet read in the book, I highly recommend reading this. But this is ultimately of a horse that could do math, that's not actually doing math. So to cut the long story short, what was happening is people were giving math problems via cards to this horse, and this horse was ultimately able to do addition and subtraction by tapping its foot to indicate how or what numerical value. But what was happening is the testers who were giving Hans these questions would change their posture a little bit once the correct number of taps had been achieved, and it turned out that the horse was actually responding to that subtle change in their body posture and not actually doing math. Because as soon as you gave questions to Clever Hans without the person being present or knowing what that particular answer was, Clever Hans could no longer do math. And so this just goes to show you even things that are almost below our conscious threshold of perception can ultimately bias our actions, which can lead to huge problems when conducting research when you're trying to figure out how people function or why they do what they do. So the way that we deal with observer effects is oftentimes through the use of masked designs, and masked designs are those situations in which the observers themselves or the researchers are unaware of the experimental conditions that the participants have been assigned to. Now, please note, if you were to look up in the glossary of your textbook, it says that this is also referred to as a double-blind design, but technically speaking, a double-blind design is a subset of masked designs where both the observers and the participants do not know what conditions they are. There are some cases where only a researcher will be not told about the context in which participants are, but by ethical rules, you've had to tell the participants which group or condition they're going to find themselves in. All of that would be under masked designs. Double-blind is the specific case where neither participants nor researchers know what condition they're in. And this type of study design, the double-blind, is widely used in medical research. In fact, it's considered the sort of gold standard of good medical research, because when you're giving medications to people, the concept of placebos is unbelievably strong. And while this might be surprising to some of you, there is a well-documented phenomena that using placebos can have significant and real-world health consequences on individuals. And this effect is so strong that you can give people placebos and tell them it's a placebo, and it will still cause effects on them, which is pretty unbelievable. This is a relatively new field of research, but more and more effort is being put here just to look at the connections between our minds and our bodies and how our expectations can dramatically change our overall health. Other ways of dealing with this is just you train your researchers to try and be as careful as possible and to minimize the amount of contact that they have with the participants themselves. Another way that this oftentimes gets at least minimized is the use of scripts, such that the observers or researchers always say and do exactly or as close to exactly the same things with each of the participants that come in, thus minimizing the effect that they might have on participants' behavior. Another big problem that comes up with observational research is referred to as reactivity, and this is the specific term for when a participant changes their behavior when they know that they're being watched. And ultimately, all of us can probably attest to this just by virtue of how relatively straightforward it is to give a talk in front of a mirror or in a closed room, and how the feelings are so utterly different when you have to actually give that presentation in front of a live audience. Now, if people are beginning to change their behaviors when they know that they're being watched, this is a very serious impact to our validity, because now what we're measuring is how people are modulating their behaviors instead of the original behaviors that we're after. Now, also just a fun fact to show how dramatic this impact can be, even if there is nobody watching, even if there's not even the illusion of somebody watching, but just a trigger to get people to think about the concept of being watched, that can be enough to change people's behavior. In fact, there's a series of studies that showed that just placing stickers of eyes in bathrooms near the sink will increase the rate at which people wash their hands, because it's thought that the stickers of eyes will prime feelings of being watched, which ultimately modulates people's behavior. Right? Just stickers. They don't even have to be actual, they can be cartoonized stickers, and it still works. This is also the use of security cameras, for example. Even if a security camera is not plugged in, people will actually have better behavior and less stealing behaviors, for example, in the presence of said video camera. And if you would like to see a somewhat morbid but very real-world consequence of how this is used in the current prison industrial complex, I highly recommend looking up what the panopticon is and how it is used to cause prisoners to ultimately self-surveil themselves, which dramatically lowers the requirement of having multiple guards to watch over prisoners. The ways that we deal with reactivity when we are doing observational research is through either being unobtrusive in our observations, and that could be done by wearing disguises or observing from covert locations or using like telephoto lenses or binoculars. Now that can sometimes be a little bit weird, so as we'll talk about on the last slide, it should always be covered with the IRB to make sure it is ethical. But other than that, this is kind of how that would work. And the reason that helps is because it minimizes the presence of a person on other people's awareness, and thus they're less likely to change their behaviors. Another way of dealing with this is through acclimation. This happens a lot in animal research, but just as much in certain types of observational research dealing with human beings. And this refers to the idea that you become present or you go again and again and again at fixed times to a certain location where you'll be doing the observation, just so that you become a normal feature there and you no longer elicit surprise or concern from all of the individuals who are there. Another way that you could potentially deal with this, but this is kind of like sidestepping the problem, is to measure the behavioral impressions or the leftover impacts from people's behaviors. So this would be akin to using footsteps in the sand as a marker that people have been to a beach instead of actually just looking for the people. Now, if you are going to go this route, one should be very careful that you actually are measuring the same thing that you set out to measure. If you read through your textbook, you'll find that one of the examples that they use for this specific situation is using how much alcohol bottles or empty alcohol bottles are present in a certain area as an index of how much alcohol is being consumed in that community. So one would need to be careful. That might make a lot of sense if I was here, let's say in Oakland, but where I grew up in Pakistan, for example, it was illegal to have any type of alcohol. And so oftentimes what people would do is they would keep all of their empty bottles and then they would go on a garbage run where they were marked dumpsters at different places in the city where it was known that there's not likely to be police activity or video cameras or surveillance and that kind. And many people would go to dump their empty alcohol bottles in similar locations. And so without being aware of such a thing, one could erroneously come to the conclusion that that neighborhood had a very high incidence of alcohol consumption, when in fact it was just lots of people were going there because it had dumpsters that were not observed. So when you are going this route, it can oftentimes be very effective, but care should be made to ensure that the impressions you're now using actually reflect the behaviors you were originally after. Now finally, a little bit about the ethics of observational research. So by and large, anywhere where a person could naturally be seen or watched by a stranger is ultimately fair game for observational research. So if you're sitting in a park or at a library or something like this where other people are just around and loitering, let's say, would be normal and acceptable for observational research. That being said, the ultimate arbiter of this is always going to be an IRB. You should always be going through an IRB if you're doing research. We've talked about this already. So ultimately, they will define and decide what things are acceptable and what things are not. Now, also another thing that is important to remember is that regardless of location, if any identifying material is recorded, so anything that could specifically be used to identify individuals, then consent must be obtained before using that data and ideally before even obtaining that data in the first place.